Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think it is just about afternoon now. It's been an absolutely fascinating day. The energy in the building today, I think, is remarkable, and I think it's a great honour to be able to be one of the many speakers here at this Europe's largest AI. A whole day of ethics, a whole day of ethics tomorrow. And what we wanted to get to in this session is to really get into the practicalities of what ethics can mean on a day-to-day basis for businesses, and how we maybe move from the theory of ethics to kind of what can companies do, what can maybe you do today as you leave events, organizations. My mic's on? Yeah. So first of all, I should do some introductions. My name is Antony. I'm CEO of TechUK. And is this mic still working, or am I going to go to the handheld? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. I'm Deputy CEO of TechUK, which is a technology trade association based here in the UK. And we work with a very broad range of technology companies, from some of the largest in the world through to a long tail of UK mid-sized and smaller firms. We've been engaged in the debate around ethics for some time, and indeed directly with some of the people who are on the panel today. I'm delighted that we've got a real breadth and range of experience and insight on this panel. We have Dame Colette Bowe, who is a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation, very much involved in the establishment of the Lovelace Institute, something that I think many of you will have heard of already, but who's had a long career in terms of working as a civil servant, but working also as a regulator, and also many places on boards with different types of businesses and organizations. So I think Colette's going to give us a really interesting perspective of what ethics might mean from the perspective of a board. We have Hetan, Shah, who is the Executive Director of the Royal Statistical Society. Again, a very august body that has done a lot of work thinking about some of the ethics issues, and particularly from the point of view of the kind of the core data and the integrity of that. We have Rachel Coldicutt, who's the the CEO of Doteveryone. Again, a body that I think many people will have heard been very vocal about some of the big kind of challenges and ethical questions that the sector faces. And then Francesca Rossi, who is the global lead for AI ethics at IBM, a company that is right at the forefront of everything that's happening in terms of development of technology, that is putting ethics right at the center of their whole approach. And then Nigel Houlden, who's head of technology policy at the ICO, who's going to be here to give us the regulators' perspective. And how does all of this, linking back to the previous discussion, how does all the ethics kind of link back to the regulation, and in particular GDPR? But to kick us off, I wanted to start with Hetan. And with this, and my question to you really was, to what extent do we have a good grasp and a good understanding of the core ethical questions? Is now a time when we've got to have much more debate about what does ethics means, or are we getting to the point where there's quite a lot of consensus about the challenges that we face and what we need to do about them?
Thanks, Antony. I think that there is a lot of consensus about quite a lot of the questions. If any of you saw Google's ethical AI principles, which were released at the back end of last week, they provide a kind of useful starting point. I won't go through them all, but some of the sorts of things you'll have all heard of: privacy, bias, governance, accountability, transparency. I think there's, from a stats perspective, there's a competence issue of, correlation doesn't always mean causation, and especially as you start, I don't care if that's the case if Amazon is recommending a book to me, but once you start using algorithms in public policy making, the failure rate of your algorithm starts becoming much more important. So these are some of the kind of ethical basket issues. But obviously there will be issues that we haven't yet predicted. It wasn't clear when Facebook was setting up a kind of sharing site to connect with your friends that they were going to subvert democracy with it. It became clearer over time, and they were pretty slow to figure that out and react to it. But there was a point when it wouldn't have been an obvious thing to do, and I'm sure that with other technologies that will be the case as well. There'll be a lot of sectoral specific issues. So if you're doing healthcare, there will be a lot of healthcare issues which will be different from other areas. And similarly, driverless cars will raise their own issues. So I think we've got to think about this largely at a sector level, and that's the place to start. And I think the Google framework is a sort of useful starting point. The Open Data Institute has got a good data ethics canvas. So there are now tools floating around there that you can start thinking about as well. The final point I wanted to make is one where I think as you jump into ethics, you can often start thinking about, how do we minimize the harm of what we're doing? But I would really like everyone in this audience to think about how do you use your company to do good in society? That's got to be the really important question. We as a community have got access to some very, very powerful tools. What is it that you can be doing to create positive change in society? So turning that round to the fundamental business model rather than thinking, this is how I'm going to make money and then let's try and rein in the negative side effects.
Yeah, thank you. She's a really nice link into Francesca, in that, IBM is a company that its products and services kind of underpin so much of the other things that happen across society. So that question about how do you make sure that your technology is used for good, and how are you working within IBM to drive that kind of core ethical thinking within the business?
Yeah, so IBM has been, been doing technology for more than 100 years, even when AI was not in the picture. So the idea of responsibility, diversity, these issues were there since the start, I think. And so with AI, we are in a specific AI place, which is AI for, enterprise AI, rather than consumer AI. So there are companies so a company that works to build AI for other enterprises to include AI in their business processes, in helping their professionals to do better their job, okay? So in that space, you have, for example, compared to consumer AI, you have much less data, you have more domain knowledge, you have regulations in various sectors, so you have to be able to combine all this information, not just data, to understand how to make the best of the technology to help those professionals. So AI ethics has to be thought for companies in that space, in that environment. How to help people, how to augment people's capability to make decisions, whatever they have to do. Okay, and not just to provide services to I mean just in a diminutive way. It's a different space. To provide services like other companies in consumer AI are doing. And so AI ethics has to be spelled out in various sectors, and I think that IBM is the right place, in my view, to really understand what that means, because IBM has a very deep understanding of very many different, most of the sectors, healthcare, financial services, transportation, and in each one of them, as was said already, AI ethics may mean differently. You can have bias, for example, that can come up from different sources, depending on the sector, depending on the kind of AI that you're producing. So you have to think about how to detect and mitigate bias in these various sectors in various ways. So within the company, what we are trying to do, not just me, but many people, we start from understanding the client needs, what they care about, what AI ethics means for them, and that can drive our research efforts, in understanding, again, how to detect and mitigate bias in the data, in the model, and in various parts of the AI services that we produce, how to build explainability, because we think that since we produce AI to work together with humans, explainability is a key. Whether there is the GDPR or not that requires it, explainability is necessary to achieve that level of trust, at the correct level of trust, not over trust, not under trust, that the human has to have in the AI system working with him. Okay? So then research, of course, publishes papers and does, research efforts around these topics. And then some of these are going to be transferred into the units that produce services and products for our clients. So so that it can be kind of disseminated to all our products. So that's the way, that's the cycle that we have in order to understand AI ethics. But we want to do that, I think, as was mentioned also earlier in the previous panel, in my view, the only way to do that well and with success in doing a multi-gender, of course, but also multidisciplinary approach. So I think that AI companies should, come to terms that they don't have to have just AI people, but also experts in other disciplines that understand these AI ethics, just to identify the issues. And then the solutions can be found by AI people, but identify, understand the issues, and so on. So multidisciplinary and also multi-stakeholders. You have to listen to those that are going to actually deploy your AI services to the real world, but you also have to listen to those that will be impacted by your AI services, and to understand really what it means for them, because maybe you think about some impact, but the impact that really they care about is different from what you think. So that's why working within the company is important, but also working in a collaborative way, in multi-stakeholder entities also, besides the boundaries of your company. Like you may know that we put together this partnership on AI that is a very multi-stakeholder initiative where companies, together with the NGOs, civil society, and many others, universities, of course, but also many others are really engaged in understanding the issues and giving best practices on how to resolve them. So that's very important, removing these boundaries of just working within one discipline, within one company, and so on.
And in terms of how IBM has had to kind of put that into practice in terms of the way in which the organization works on a daily basis, because I mean your CEO has set out a very kind of clear statement in terms of the centrality of ethics to the business. How is that sort of driven down through the business, and how do you make sure that people within the business feel empowered to raise ethical concerns if they see something happening that they think, hang on, there are unforeseen questions here?
So, for example, one thing that we do is we want really to help our developers, but in general, I think developers need help and they ask for help in understanding how to think about these issues in their everyday job. How to embed ethical considerations and solutions from these issues since the design phase and into all the development phase of the thinking and developing and then deploying of the product. It's clear by now, I think that everybody agrees, that ethics cannot be something that is like a patch that you put at the end where the product is ready to be deployed, because that's not going to work. So you really have to think about making the product ethical, whatever that means in that context, from the moment that you think about building this product, the design. So we are building, for example, documents that are going to help these people thinking about these issues and trying to understand how to resolve them in all these phases, okay? And again, as you said, I mean, the company is very, AI ethics to me has at least these two angles. One, you want to build AI systems that behave ethically, means they are fair, they are transparent, they are interpretable, explainable, and so on, once you have deployed. And second, you want corporations to behave ethically, for example, with respect to data responsibility and data policies and data issues, okay? So there are these two angles, and I think the corporations have the responsibility to be transparent in both directions. Yeah.
So it sounds like a sort of mantra of by design, ethics by design, and making sure it's really mainstreamed. I want to now come to Rachel, so we just heard from the perspective of one of the biggest companies in the world focused on the development of AI. What does ethics mean from a practical level for small businesses, startups, scale-ups, or companies that are thinking about using AI to drive a solution within their business? Because it's an area that you've been looking at quite a lot. And what are the kind of practical tools that can be made available to them to enable them to just get going on the journey?
Sure. So we, over the last year, have done quite a lot of research talking to businesses who are making products, and the thing that stands out is that compromise is often an accident. So compromises are made in the development process because there isn't enough time, because there are 20 things happening at once, because something gets pushed into the backlog and someone says, oh yeah, we will totally sort it out later, and it never happens. And that even if you have really kind of clear guiding big picture ethics, actually to break it down into meaning in the day is really hard. So over the last 6 months, we've been developing a toolkit which we're hoping will help people in organizations that don't have all the infrastructure that you have. And it really comes in 2 parts. There's a leadership element where it's really about having your leadership team understand the consequences, the value flows of their strategy. Ethics, in a practical sense, is a really hard term because everybody thinks they're ethical, but the ethical code and the values that the people in the leadership team have are totally different. There could be people who believe in, who have an extremely capitalist approach. There could be people who believe in distributing wealth. And often that isn't really baked into how a company thinks about its work. So it's taking it out of the personal and turning it into trackable elements. And then importantly, the thing that we're starting to alpha test at the end of June, and if anyone's interested, say hi at the end, is a toolkit that development teams are able to use across the sprints. So we're particularly looking at the beginning, mapping the value flows, social impact, and we've made a game that the product teams can play to understand how the choices they're making are likely to play out. And then it drills down into really practical things in terms of understanding the diversity of your team, understanding the trade-offs, keeping track of choice. And our hope is that by creating a thing that works at the level of either a product or a feature, it's able to scale up. And so the big company could have hundreds of those instances, whereas a startup can have a single one.
And because one of the points you made there was, because we talk a lot about ethics being linked to human values, but human values is precisely what politics is all about. And so it seems to me if you look around the world,
absolutely,
we're not terribly good at kind of coming to a kind of real kind of consensus around some of those big political questions, and so because it seems to me one of the challenges we have with businesses is that businesses aren't necessarily there to answer all those big political questions, but they are there to develop innovative products and services. And do you feel that there's an opportunity? It seems to me there's a big opportunity there to drill down to the practical and the pragmatic for businesses, and away from sometimes this bigger discussion about that it's all about human values. Because for me, if I was leading a business, that's where it just gets really complicated and difficult.
Yeah, and there's then a really interesting play between brand and ethics. So really, in a business context, ethics are a part of brand as much as they're a part of the strategy, and that really your ethical position ought to be clear in the outcomes of the products as opposed to the statements. And so obviously the greatest example of this is the Google disconnect between don't be evil and everything else. You know, so it's kind of, if you're going to make really kind of big, grand statements, they have to really granularly act out in the products. And so I think our perspective is ultimately your consumers are going to be making a choice based on a number of outcomes, like whether it's price, convenience, social impact, and it's turning those things that are very abstract in an already incredibly abstract context. And so the thing that we've been thinking about a lot this year is how can people choose things they don't understand, and how can you turn things that are quite abstract and intangible into things that can be signaled clearly. And previously, I heard there was talk about, the potential for a trust mark or something. And we've done quite a lot of work on that. And the big problem that we see at the moment is that explaining, like, that, say that a difference between the standards, a company that is creating a self-driving car to a company that's looking after drones to a company that does targeted advertising, that they will have to have are so completely different that having a single mark is hard. But being transparent and honest is probably harder in a corporate capacity, but ultimately probably easier.
So it's really ethics in context and the practical application. Colette, can I turn to you? So I mean, this whole session is talked about kind of beyond legal compliance. I'm really interested in kind of the role that boards play. So boards have a very, very clear role when it comes to compliance issues. But boards also have to think about brand and brand value and maintaining that brand. So what is the role that boards can and should play as we kind of think forward about these new sets of ethical questions and challenges that seem to emerge out of AI?
Thanks very much, Antony. I should explain to the audience that in addition to what Antony mentioned when he introduced me, my day job is chairing the Banking Standards Board, which is I spend all my time thinking about how these issues affect the banking sector and its customers. First thing I'd say is that, like in any business, it's the responsibility of the board to articulate and carry through what are the values of the business. And I disagree with you a bit about that, Antony. I don't think it's necessarily a board's job to talk about human values and get involved in sort of political issues. But I think any board worth its salt ought to be able to say, this is the purpose of our business, and these are the values that we exemplify in delivering that purpose. And if the board can't do that, then there's something wrong, I would say, number one. Number two, is that about complying with something? Well, of course, compliance is important, but it's only what you would call a necessary condition. It's not sufficient. The whole ethical basis of how you do business has got to be in the company. It's got to be in everything people do. It's got to be, people have got to have, in a way of saying to each other, you know what, that's not how we do business around here. And people have got to understand that and be confident enough to say that. That means, from the standpoint of the board, you've got to ensure that people don't just think that this is about narrow compliance, important though compliance is. From the standpoint of the board, you can't regard this as something you can sort of outsource to some other body. You know, it isn't enough to say, oh, well, we'll have an ethics audit and then that'll help. The board's got to actually be able to say what the ethical standards of the business are and then check that they're being adhered to. And that's something that only they can do. I've just said that this goes beyond regulation, Antony. Something that's in the banking sector that's happened that is quite interesting, and in fact in the financial services sector more widely, is that as a consequence of many regulatory changes following the financial crisis of 10 years ago, the regulators in the UK now require the chairman of a financial services business explicitly to be responsible for articulating and delivering the culture of the business. Now that's a gigantic change. 10 years ago, if you'd have said, let's talk about culture, people would have said, what on earth are you talking about? This is a business, we don't talk about culture here. So things have changed, and things have changed in the financial services industry because of the crisis, not because of the advent of AI, although that is kind of amplifying and accelerating what has happened. The final thing I'd like to say, Antony, is I'd like to mention a word that people haven't yet invoked in this room while I've been here this morning, and that's the word trustworthy. If you are really delivering, if you are really running an ethical business that is meeting the needs of your customers, you should be worthy of trust. Trust isn't something you can demand. You've got to be able to show that you're worth it. And it's a word that sometimes isn't quite there in the dialogue, but it's got to be.
Thank you. I mean, I think I was precisely agreeing with you on the point about the difficulty of businesses having to address what are seen as political issues, and because I think the business has to draw it back to a business issue and rather than a political issue. One question I had was around, because clearly ethical decisions, it's about decision making, it's about decision making throughout the organization. And how do you go about, as a board, making sure that you're empowering people within the organization to feel that they can raise or flag issues or concerns? Because very often, you know, the detail, you know, won't be evident and transparent to the board.
Well, the detail might not be, but the board has got to make sure that it's highly challenging to its executive team on this. And there are lots of good practice about this in boards. There's, you know, it's a matter of training. It's a matter of being very alert to what might be happening, not at your head office, but at another location. And I'm afraid there's no substitute for boards, but to do what you might, in a rather homespun way, call kicking the tires. And if you don't kick the tires and you're sitting on a board, things could end not in a good place.
And is it your view that, so this is kind of business as usual for boards, yep. Which I think I can agree with, but is there any kind of a capacity challenge, or are there any things that where boards need to increase their knowledge and awareness, or are there different kinds of questions that boards need to be asking, or should most boards be fully able and capable and competent to address some of these questions? Does anything really need to change, and maybe more generally in the culture around boards?
I think that's a really good and challenging question for boards, Antony. One of the things that I think any board has got to have is the ability to ask itself what it's missing. And at the moment, I think any corporate board worth its salt is going to be thinking, how on earth do we understand the challenge, for example, that AI is going to pose for our business? and should be seeking to equip itself with the right advice on how to set about understanding these issues. My message for boards is, you know, nothing's ever done, nothing's ever finished. You've got to keep your mind open to what's going on now, and we have got to get ourselves trained up to understand it.
Thank you, thank you. Nigel, I wanted to come to a kind of regulator's perspective. So again, the session is talking about how you can think and act beyond legal compliance. What does that mean from a regulator's perspective? Because you're all about legal compliance. You have a very kind of clear legal framework which you have to oversee and implement. Where does the sort of broader ethics that sits on top, where does that become relevant to you in terms of your day job?
To start with, Antony, I mean, I must sort of remind everybody, GDPR wasn't designed as an ethical framework, but what's actually kind of fell out of it, which I found quite interesting, is it seems to be aligning with, through research that's been done, through citizens' juries that have been done, the idea of transparency, fairness, accountability seem to be what the public want. So it's more by, I won't use the word luck, more by fate than design, that from what I can see as the regulator, what the public want is fitting well with what GDPR can control. Some of the things, you know, privacy by design is, again, it's part of GDPR. We, you know, as a regulator, we want to see data privacy impact assessments, and in some cases it's mandatory to do data privacy impact assessments. So, and it's good to see those, and if you want public confidence, you know, anonymize those by all means, but publish them. Show your clients that you are taking privacy seriously. And I think sort of an interesting twist from that could be for an organization itself to maybe look at ethical impact assessments. And maybe it could look at publishing them as well alongside its privacy impact assessments to show it's actually considered both. So I think there's a lot that GDPR offers us. I think there's a lot outside of that GDPR doesn't wander into, simply because, like I say, it wasn't designed to be an ethical framework. I think from an AI perspective, I think there's an awful lot looking at the transparency, the accountability that can be achieved without necessarily cracking open the black box. I think a lot of people's concern is about looking at the variables that were input into those, and the answer that came out is how far away are those input variables from actually getting, if you like, the positive answer. So if you requested a loan or something like that, and that was the input, and the output was no, well, how far do you have to move your inputs to get a successful output? Now, things like that, from what I've seen, is what people wish to know. It's getting that answer back. And that starts to fulfill the fairness, to a certain extent to the accountability. From the transparency point of view, again, people seem quite happy with the idea of, if you like, qualified transparency, which is somebody like a regulator giving some assessment, some assurance that it is being run fairly and positively. I mean, and from that point of view, companies may be happy to give us demographic information. You know, somebody got rejected for a loan. If they're happy to show us the last 10,000 cases that they've dealt with and show us the pattern and look at the demographics compared to the person who's complained, there's a certain amount of transparency in that as well. So there's a lot of things without having to break open the black box that, from a regulator's point of view, we can do. Like I say, leaning towards the ethics side of it, I think GDPR is probably a good place to start. Since one person's ethics might not be another person's ethics, the one thing GDPR does do is give a damn good starting point. It actually is very clear about transparency, accountability, fairness. And like I say, they're things that people seem to want to see. So if that is a starting point, it's a good starting point. And the nice thing is it actually does bring it back into legal compliance for people, because that's what the ICO is there for.
Yeah, I mean, it's often felt to me as if GDPR kind of provides the legal foundations on which the sort of ethics then sits. But you're also sort of suggesting there that there's actually quite a lot of ethics within GDPR, or that comes out of interpretation of GDPR, that particularly at a time when sometimes interpretation of the exact meaning of GDPR can be quite difficult. If you come at it from, well, what do I think, what's the sort of ethical dimension, then presumably that's quite a good guide to GDPR compliance in areas where you might not be entirely sure exactly what GDPR compliance means in the particular context of the issues and questions that your business has.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very good point to start with. If you're not sure how the legislation interprets, obviously come and talk to the ICO. But if you took an ethical stance, it's probably a strong position to start with. If you sit there and think, okay, I have these people's data, what should I do with it? Well, to exploit them is unethical. Well, to exploit is also against GDPR as well. So you start to find that line. Like I say, GDPR was never designed to be an ethical framework, but it gives a very solid place for people to feel comfortable. But we hope that organizations can feel comfortable with it as well. The fact that they've got a point to start, a point to build from, and move forward. I mean, the Commission is very fond of actually saying we're not the Department of No. We want to get out there, we want companies to know that we want them to be innovative, to move forward. We're starting to consult on a sandbox. So we know AI is going to be a big thing that comes into that. So again, although we can't make ethical considerations, if a company comes to us from a position of having an ethical point of view and a good, strong ethical standpoint, there's a fair chance it is going to align with GDPR.
I mean, I think that's really useful insight for companies that are maybe struggling with exactly how GDPR applies to them. You know, I think that's really good guidance. Francesca, I just wanted to come back to you on the GDPR point. And in terms of your ethical framework at a global level, how consistent does GDPR feel with your global ethical framework? Does it feel aligned, or are there areas where you think it could be problematic?
So there are some parts of the GDPR that are completely aligned. For example, the explainability. So we think that every AI system should be able to explain why a certain decision or a certain recommendation has been made. As I said, independently of the regulations, whether there is a regulation that requires it or not. But also our data responsibility policy that we published more than a year ago, it says, but not just says, we follow it, meaning that we are not going to reuse the data of our clients or the insights coming from the data of our clients for other tasks, other clients, other projects, And that, of course, reassures our clients, that can trust us in dealing with their data. But of course, it puts us in a position where, as I said before, we can rely on even less data, which means that we have to come up with other ways of combining the available domain knowledge and other knowledge that we can exploit to make sure that the product that we develop is really, the best one that we can give. So explainability and dealing with data in that way definitely is at the core of our business units, and it involves also research and the other parts. Yeah.
Right. Hetan, I wanted to just come back to you. You and I, the last couple of years, have talked a lot about the role of independent bodies, emerging independent bodies. So we've got the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which hopefully we'll hear more about this week. We've got the Lovelace Institute, really sort of getting up and running. At the practical level, how can these kind of bodies kind of play a useful role that really helps companies on the ground or researchers on the ground who want to do the right thing?
So when I started off, I said that there are some issues which are sectoral and some issues which are very cross-cutting. I think these bodies could quite quickly set up guidance on the cross-cutting issues. So algorithmic explainability, we already know quite a lot about how that might happen. So let's just put that down and tell everyone what that is. Similarly, let's map the different standards that are out there on ethics and put them in one place and say, here are the sort of major issues, as it were. But then these bodies can't work directly with every company. So they've got a cascade. I mean, my recommendation for the Centre for Data Ethics was it should be building the capacity of existing regulators, because it's the regulators who don't yet know what's about to hit them in how their industry is going to change. And so if they can think this through, that would be very helpful. I think companies themselves need to take some responsibility. So setting up their own ethics boards, advisory panels is really helpful. So I used to be on the Office for National Statistics Data Ethics Advisory Board, and that was really interesting because you wouldn't know what the answer to the question was straight away. And it's only when you get the real case and the real case law that you actually start making, you know, decisions on what the ethics are, because there's often a public interest to do something, but it may be harmful to certain people. And you've got to think through the specifics of that case and then generalize and say, what do we learn from that? Final thing I wanted to mention whilst I've got the mic is just to say, there's an interesting question, links to what you've asked, which is about where's the pressure going to come from for ethics? And it seems to me, post-Facebook Cambridge Analytica, it's noticeable, you know, Facebook usage seems to be still pretty strong, and the markets didn't really, you know, they were hit very briefly, but then moved back up again. So it doesn't seem to me that consumers or markets are necessarily going to be the key force here. I think we need to look to civil society, and I hope civil society will play a key role in this. And the other thing, which is interesting, and this again is the Google case study, is the workers. So actually people within the industry can drive change, and in a sense you've got a key role to drive that change because it may not come from outside.
Nigel, just on that point about other regulators, I'm curious about the extent to which some of your colleagues in regulatory bodies elsewhere across the economy, I mean, have they been coming to the ICO to try and understand more about some of these issues? Is there any kind of dialogue that takes place? Is there any information sharing that takes place across regulators, or is it still quite sort of siloed?
There's an awful lot of informal communication between all the regulators. Yeah, we have very good relationships with people like the Financial Conduct Authority, simply because if there's personal data involved somewhere, we tend to talk to them a lot anyway. So there is always crosstalk. It is something I wish to foster more of. We were talking a little earlier before we came on stage about a technology reference panel, and I'd certainly love to see, you know, different regulators dropping into that to actually talk to us, to actually give their point of view so we can help understand it. Like I said earlier, you know, the Commissioner's very keen that we're not the Department of No. We represent people's rights, citizens' rights, but at the same time we want to understand what industry's concerns are and how we can explain things to them to get them moving forward.
Colette, I think you wanted to come.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add a point on that, Antony, which is we've mentioned the Ada Lovelace Institute just being set up by the Nuffield Foundation. One of the purposes of Ada Lovelace is going to be to help with precisely these issues. We need to have a place where people can even begin to talk about how might we understand what the problem is, i.e. way back from, okay, we have a problem, what are we going to do about it? And the point of Ada Lovelace is to create, we hope, a kind of space where people can start to have those discussions. And I would love it if everybody in the room had a good look at the Nuffield Foundation website and read a bit more about Ada Lovelace there.
Thank you very much. And is it your sense that, you know, the questions around ethics can be an iterative process? We don't have to have all of the answers to stop us from, you know, from doing good practical work.
I mean, the thing about ethics, Antony, is they're not fixed things. You know, it's possible that what we think about, what we think might be ethical behavior now might seem extraordinary to people who are not living either at this moment or possibly people who live in a different sort of culture. So I would say there's nothing particularly fixed about ethics. It's a bit of a moving target. You can never think sorted, tick the box, done, because it won't be.
Thank you. We've got 1 minute left. Hopefully, I think that's been a really interesting session, so I'd like to thank all of you for your comments. I mean, what we were trying to do today was really to take ethics away from a sort of very ethereal sort of discussion to really about what's practical and the very real practical things that can be done today. So we don't have to wait until there is a new kind of global ethical framework for ethics in this area to actually get on and do good work within our organizations. I think we've heard today from this perspective of one of the largest multinationals that's absolutely at the forefront of technological innovation. We've heard from the perspective of, kind of small emerging companies that are starting to think about how to organize themselves. And I think, and in particular, the vital role that governance and boards play. And actually, this is just a continuation of the normal of what we've already done. So, AI and ethics doesn't have to be something that's sort of exceptional and new. Actually, it's about business innovation, technology innovation, and good governance. And there are things that we can all do today to make real progress. So, hopefully, the message from today is we don't have to wait for some big global ethical framework, some G7 agreement on ethics. There is stuff that we can all get on with today. And on that note, I think we have run out of time. I think the speakers are going to be available in the room for the Q&A after this. I actually have no idea where that room is, but I think it's over there somewhere. If you want to come and join us and continue the conversation, please do. But if you'd like to join me in thanking our panel for their great insights this morning. Thank you.